Okay, everyone, welcome to our last lecture of our intensive semester in APG 5091. It's just after the Easter break now in week 6. So already this semester we've tackled some of the really big and important topics in international relations, including war and peace. We've looked at climate change, we've looked at humanitarianism, refugee flows, and now we're going on to a subject that has touched all of our lives in the last couple of years, global pandemics. So this obviously has a great relevance for the current moment and what we've experienced in the last few years. And I'm going to suggest, how is this relevant to international relations? Why do we care about pandemics in IR? And how does it fit within international relations theory? Okay, so let's go to our first slide. So these are the learning objectives for today. Looking to understand the relevance of pandemics to international relations, scholarship and practice, most importantly. And then we also want to connect the health crises and our interrelated systems of governance, politics, and economy, most importantly. So these are what we're going to try to do with this lecture as well as this upcoming week. And just to remind everyone, we have 2 required readings here. So this has changed just slightly from what was there probably about a week ago, just because I've just made it a little bit easier on you rather than reading a chapter from a book. I've just put 2 journal articles there, but I'd really encourage you all as well, if you have a chance, to have a look at the recommended readings this week, especially the one by Tom Shador and Shahar Hamieri, because this will constitute really important background reading before we have Dr. Tom Shador talk to us in our workshop this week. But I'll speak a little bit more about that soon. And probably the only other reminder, which I'll just say at the moment, and I will repeat at the end, is that you have your last MCQ quiz opening this coming week. But please keep in mind, firstly, I'm fairly certain it's got an extended due date, so it's not just until the Friday, but it also, most importantly, will quiz you not only on this week's required readings, but potentially other readings from the unit. So only the required readings, but other required readings from previous weeks, because this is like the all weeks quiz. So it is possible that you might see readings or questions from readings from previous weeks. It's highly likely, actually, as well as these 2 papers. So everything is on the table, but just keep in mind that the weeks that I haven't created MCQ quizzes for, which is this week and week 1, are probably much more likely to have questions associated with them rather than other weeks where I've already quizzed you on. So if you want to do selective reading, I would focus on those weeks where you haven't been quizzed on yet for this upcoming one. Okay, so let's dive into global pandemics. So I know we're obviously all studying international relations here, obviously, but I'm still going to go into a little bit of the biomedical background of COVID-19. And, I know most of us are probably quite familiar with a lot of this, but I'm hoping to bring in little bits of, information which will either set us nicely for a more expansive discussion soon, and also maybe even, bring some items or pieces of knowledge to light which you mightn't have heard before. So COVID-19, what is it? Coronavirus disease 2019, otherwise known as COVID-19, is caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is otherwise known as SARS-CoV-2. So that's the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses belong to the family Coronaviridae, which produces kind of mild to severe respiratory disease in humans. We typically find coronaviruses in various animals, such as bats, birds, cattle, cats, and even pigs. And in recent decades, there has been three major coronavirus outbreaks worldwide. In 2002 and 2012, we had two highly pathogenic coronaviruses with zoonotic origin, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, so SARS-CoV, or otherwise just was commonly known as SARS, and as well as Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus, which is MERS, MERS-CoV, respectively, which caused fatal respiratory illnesses and making these coronaviruses a new public health concern in the 21st century. And then our third one was obviously our most recent COVID-19 pandemic. So data has shown us now that the main mode of transmission of SARS-CoV-2 is human-to-human transmission, which we've experienced obviously throughout the last few years. And it's thought to occur mainly through close contact, either in the form of respiratory droplets or aerosols. These droplets can be broadly described as macro entities that can gravitate to the ground. So they don't just float about, but they do gravitate towards the ground. So they'll be expelled and kind of land to ground approximately within 3 to 6 feet of where they're coming from. And generally, most symptomatic COVID-19 patients may infect other human beings who come in close contact. But also quite relatively uniquely, most of the asymptomatic carriers can also serve as carriers of, or asymptomatic patients rather, can serve as carriers of COVID-19 and can unknowingly transmit infection, again, which many of you are very familiar with. And this, a kind of unique aspect of COVID-19, this asymptomatic people being kind of almost as strong transmitters of the disease as those who are displaying symptoms. Maybe one of the reasons why there was such a drastically and rapidly increased infection rates worldwide, and that any kind of laxity in the practice of really stringent isolation and social distancing has caused huge outbursts in the last few years of COVID-19 infections. Now, in terms of the symptomology, the common symptom in COVID-19 patients is hypoxia, so which is a lack of oxygen, which may lead to the acute respiratory distress syndrome, which we mentioned before. And a quite unusual phenomena in COVID patients, which is seen in a lot of medical studies, is something called a silent hypoxemia. So hypoxemia literally meaning low oxygen. So a silent hypoxemia is where patients don't experience respiratory discomfort and dyspnea, which is difficulty breathing, despite having really critically low levels of oxygen. So they might not actually have the signs and symptoms of someone who has critically low amounts of oxygen, which means that's why they're called silent. And typically when we've had a look at the pulmonary or the lung pathology of decreased COVID-19 or deceased, COVID-19 patients with acute respiratory distress disorder, it shows very typical features of what we call diffuse alveolar damage, or DAD. So the alveoli are very small, kind of like bags in your lungs. They're tiny little bags that make up your lungs, where the exchange of oxygen occurs into the bloodstream. And COVID-19 has been shown to really diffusely damage all of the very small, millions of alveoli that you have in your lungs. But there's also, and many of you have heard of this, other implications of COVID-19, which might be hematological, like affecting the blood, cardiovascular, affecting the heart, renal, affecting the kidneys, neurological, the brain, dermatological, the skin, reproductive and psychiatric issues as well. And within, a very short time of COVID-19 taking hold around the world, it suddenly became a very high leading cause of death. So, for example, in the United States in 2020, COVID-19 was recorded as a third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer, with approximately 375,000 deaths just that year. And as we saw, individuals of all ages were at risk of contracting this infection, or are at risk, still are, but usually patients who are over the age of 60 years old with underlying medical comorbidities, and especially like obesity, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, diabetes, chronic lung disease, smoking, cancer, and any like transplant patients, they have an increased risk of developing really severe COVID-19 infections. And really, out of all of these other comorbidities which might cause a more severe COVID-19 symptomology, age remained kind of the strongest predictor of poor outcomes and severe illness, which is why we saw a lot more morbidity and mortality in people who were older, who contracted the disease. And the percentage of COVID-19 patients who required hospitalization was 6 times higher in those with pre-existing medical conditions than those without, which was something like 45% versus 7%. There were also some gender-based differences in the symptomology of COVID-19, which suggested that male patients had a higher risk of severe illness and mortality due to COVID-19 compared to female patients, whereas racial and ethnic minority groups also were reported as having a much higher percentage of COVID-19 related hospitalizations than Caucasian or white patients. There was an interesting meta-analysis, which is like a study examining other studies. And this meta-analysis looked at 50 studies from especially the USA and UK, and they found that people of Black, Hispanic, and Asian ethnic minority groups were at increased risk of contracting and dying from COVID-19 infection. Now, obviously, this particular meta-analysis was based in the natural sciences. And so often the natural sciences, well, we kind of always don't have theories of, why there might be differentiating impacts or differentiating disease profiles across, race, class, gender, and so forth. Whereas one of the strengths of international relations and political economy analysis can be to try to dig deeper and find out why does something like COVID-19, which theoretically could affect everyone in the same kind of way, has these differentiating impacts based on various characterizations, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about in this lecture, but more predominantly in the workshop as well. Now, according to the National Institutes of Health in America, the 2 main processes that were driving the pathogenesis or the progression of COVID-19 included the replication of the virus in the early phase of the illness, and then once the virus got into the body, dysregulated immune or inflammatory responses to it. So that means like the immune system basically just went crazy and didn't, try to attack the viruses in a more systematic and targeted way as it normally would, and was unregulated and just kind of went a bit wild. And that led to systemic kind of tissue damage in the later phases of the disease. So a lot of the treatment guidelines that we had for COVID focused on firstly, the antiviral medications, which tried to halt viral replication at the start of the illness, so in the early phases of the illness. And then secondly, the immunomodulators in the later phase, where we tried to then bring some regulation into the immune system so it didn't go crazy and attack everything. And like we mentioned before, the prognosis or the likelihood someone will get better with COVID-19 does depend on various factors. So especially age, as we mentioned, but also the severity of illness once they actually present, their pre-existing conditions, which we mentioned, and then how quickly they can actually implement the treatment. And the World Health Organization estimated, I think this was like in 2022 or so, that the global case fatality rate for COVID-19 is 2.2%, which is relatively reasonably high for viral disease. There was also a interesting paper which I saw preparing for this lecture, where it was basically showing results from a European multi-center kind of prospective cohort study that looked at 4,000 critically ill patients with COVID-19, and they reported a 90-day mortality of 31%. So after 90 days, 31% of those 4,000 people would die. And again, high mortality in the study was noted in geriatric or older patients and patients with diabetes, obesity, and severe acute respiratory distress syndrome. So this is kind of like some of the biology, epidemiology, and pathogenesis of COVID-19. Again, we're mostly really familiar with all of this stuff, but now we have a little bit more, I guess, retrospective light on, who got really, really sick and who ended up, passing away more often. So now let's talk a little bit more about the actual history of what happened. And I'm conscious of treading painful grounds of recapping what happened to us over the last few years. So this will just be a little bit of a summary. And again, I'm hoping just to maybe have little bits of information which you mightn't have known before, but just as well that we're all on the same page. And I know maybe many of our memories have blocked out what has happened due to trauma. So I'm here to relive the horror, as it were. So as everyone knows, at the end of 2019, we have a novel coronavirus, COVID-19, emerged in Wuhan in China, which caused an outbreak of some kind of viral pneumonia. So it seemed that the virus began its spread in the seafood wholesale market in the Wuhan, Hubei province of China. And it was proposed that, especially early on, that an infected animal, which is an intermediate host of the virus, was sold in the market, which then caused the spread of the virus in the marketplace. Or that there was another animal intermediary from the zoonotic host, such as a bat transmitting the virus to a domesticated animal, which then passed it on to a human in the Wuhan market. Now, however, even still, today in 2024, a number of years after, it initially happened, the evidence and debate around the exact origin of COVID-19 still does rage quite a lot. So, I'm certainly not going to make any definitive finding or suggestion either way, but there is certainly debate around the exact origin of COVID-19. In terms of, and I guess, a lot of the evidence that I look at is more of the biomedical evidence, and, basically some of the papers that I've read are still suggesting, or at least pointing towards, that there is reasonable evidence that, despite the exact origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, that bats are the natural host of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. And it's certainly likely that, or in the reasonable likelihood that they may have infected humans through some kind of intermediate host, such as, cats, for example. But, again, this is very unsure, but a lot of the biomedical literature is looking more at the zoonotic origins. But of course, there is still a lot of debate, which will probably not be resolved anytime soon. But once this COVID-19 started spreading from Wuhan, because it has such a very high transmission rate, it spread quickly to the entire globe in our very globalized world. And then on January 7th, 2020, the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention isolated a coronavirus strain from a swab of a hospitalized patient. And then the first laboratory confirmed case of COVID-19 outside China was reported by Thailand on January 13th, 2020. And then on February 11th, 2020, the International Committee on the Taxonomy of Viruses named this novel coronavirus as SARS-CoV-2, and the World Health Organization named the disease COVID-19. Now, according to the World Health Organization, which is monitoring the novel coronavirus, by the end of January 2020, COVID-19 had already spread to 19 countries outside of mainland China, and nearly 10,000 confirmed cases were already reported at that time. Then on January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak to be a public health emergency of an international concern. And then by March, when now COVID had gone to more than 100 countries, on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization then finally declared COVID-19 was a pandemic. And from that point on, as everyone knows, COVID-19 has raged across the world. By about August 2021, North America had reported the highest number of confirmed cases, followed by Europe and then Asia. The United States of America topped the list in terms of the total number of COVID-19 cases and the number of deaths, which is followed by India, Brazil, and then Russia. So since that time, we've now seen some development of mutations in COVID-19, and there's really 5 major mutated strains that have emerged. So namely Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Omicron. In July 2020, already the first discovered mutation had swept the world. Then 2 months later, after that, the variant Alpha strain was discovered in the United Kingdom, while the Beta variant was discovered in December 2020 in South Africa, Gamma variant in 2021 in Brazil, and then the Delta variant again in United Kingdom in March 2021. And then the Omicron variant was first found in November 2021 in Botswana. So by mid-2022, 551 million cases had been confirmed in more than 194 countries, and with more than 6 million fatalities, and the daily infection count had continued to rise even by that stage still. Now let's talk a little bit more of the causes of the COVID-19 crisis. So this is not only well, this is really not so much again about the origins of where COVID came from as such, but then like how did this virus cause such an enormous global crisis? And a lot of this actually will be linked quite heavily to the climate crisis, which we spoke about last week. And this does go a little bit back towards, I guess, one of the hypothesized causal origins of COVID-19, which is that the virus came from a zoonotic, through zoonotic transmissions, just like previous coronaviruses have. This connects really strongly with the issues of climate change, and global warming that we discussed last week. Sorry, just 1 second. So if you recall from our lecture last week, and I do appreciate it was quite a long one, but we spoke about that some of the issues in that a lot of critical IR theorists thought around the labeling of the climate crisis as Anthropocene versus Capitalocene was that our systems of understanding the world in general is characterized by really crude categorization, where we categorize things into categories which are separate and indistinct from one another. Even in international relations, we, for instance, see things like the state and the economy in 2 different categories. Politics and the economy, or we might see even categories of gender like male, woman. There might be then categories of animals, categories of whatever it might be. But we have this propensity to categorize objects into kind of separate, non-interacting spheres. So one of the things that we spoke about last week was that many critical theorists argued that capitalist expansion across the known world is very much based on the categorization and a Cartesian duality of firstly seeing humans as one indistinct homogeneous mass, which is then totally separate and distinct from nature, which is something that is also by itself a huge giant kind of area that humans can either expand into, they can take things freely from and use in our production processes, or where we can dump our excess waste. And then one of the issues with how economic expansion through capitalist logic has progressed, especially over the last 200 or 300 years, is that because we have this outside realm of nature, we can get things from nature, such as cheap materials, cheap rocks, cheap fuel, these kind of things, which we'd call cheap nature together. And we can also get cheap land, which would obviously sustain things like agriculture. And also within nature, we have, and historically, especially the European intellectuals and European imperial and colonial practices saw certain peoples as also being in nature, such as obviously, colonized people, then people who became slaves and so forth. And these people were also taken to be cheap labor from nature, and then obviously subjugated to be involved, usually against their will, most typically against their will, in European production processes. So last week we spoke about this separation between humans and nature, which is maintained and distinctively delineated between the two, where in reality a lot of critical theorists argue that these categories are totally abstract, and are totally illusory, because there's a very dense interlinkages between us and nature, and we are very much one in a whole global sphere with each other. So any extraction and dumping in nature will inevitably have an impact on us, which is what we're seeing now. So we can't separate these categories, and there really is no categories between human and nature. And we mentioned that there's a strain of critical thought that argues there is a world ecology between humans and nature. So all living things are intertwined with the natural environment around them. And this school of thought assumes that implementing this separation between nature and society is functional to the capitalist world ecology, which is a system not only of exponential growth, continued economic profit, but also is a way of organizing nature, as we discussed last week. And the accelerating changes in the way that capitalism as an organizing system has catalyzed in the past 70 years or so has meant that we are increasingly exposed to things like viruses and other pathological events, which is what I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about on this slide. So starting from about 1950, and remember last week we spoke about how the constant growth of the capitalist system had kind of started to run its course by this time, because there was nowhere else geographically for it to move, because it had moved, spread the whole world over. In 1950, a large proportion of the Earth's people still were peasant farmers, and predominantly in the global South. But then as recently as 1980, only, for example, 20% of China's population was urban, but now the proportion today is up to and over really 60%. So, and the number of people who are still remaining in villages around the world have usually been transformed into wage laborers, mostly for large corporate agribusiness. So as capitalism has expanded over the known world, and especially into the global South, and ironically, which accelerated after processes of decolonization, this has caused that proletarianization that we spoke about last week, where people had been kind of pushed away from rural regions into the cities to become wage workers, as what happened in many Western countries, 200 to 300 years ago. And that has allowed, or has, that process has continued alongside the move of multinational agribusiness corporations to purchase and control vast swathes of farmland and agricultural tracts. And this kind of relentless march of corporate agribusiness throughout the world has meant that even countries such as India are facing an uprising of small farmers whose livelihoods are severely threatened with destruction by this kind of neoliberal reform. And so, desperate is their plight, as we've seen in the last few years, that there's, huge record numbers of India's small farmers committing suicide because of this pressure from agribusiness and neoliberal reforms to privatize and sell off peasant farmland. So as well as, trying to scramble for more land, which then destroys a lot of traditional peasant communities, agribusiness is actually now continuing to expand more into the wilderness, especially in areas where there's poor regulation, and there's uprooting of forests, which destroy the diversity and balance of natural ecologies, and then replaces them with vast monocultures or monocropping. So might have, typically like in some global south countries, Brazil is probably a good example, but Ukraine is also another fine one too, where agribusinesses have come in and have either totally destroyed pristine, grasslands or forests or rainforests, and then in their place have planted just monocrops of like soya, for instance, wheat, corn, whatever it might be. And so now we're at a stage where half of the Earth's habitable surface is now devoted to agriculture, with millions more acres being added every year. And much of this cropland produces really just animal feed for the hundreds of millions of cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry, which are being fast fattened for the global supply chains that loop the world. And so this mega complex of big farms, industrialized animal production, are laced around and between all of these farms that have grown to huge sizes at the cost of forcing many peasant farmers off their traditional land. And so this process of this corporate agribusiness expansion into the wilderness is what connects what seems like a remote bat cave in hinterland China with the might we say, like the morgues of New York and London. So big farm or large corporate agribusinesses batter down natural ecology. They often destroy diversity and monocrop and dominate wilderness landscapes. And so viruses that would have previously burnt themselves out in the forest and wouldn't have really gone anywhere for lack of carriers, have adapted to a new ecology of monoculture, animal factories, and even slum cities of humans who are often very closely related to animal factories in really crowded and poorly controlled environments. And these viruses, they mutate and evolve and then can achieve fast-track transmission through mass concentrations of the same species, whether in animal factories or in human slums in major cities. And once then a new variant is established, it replicates at hyperspeed, and then it throws up, at chance mutations, which then tests new ways of spreading itself. The disease will then become endemic and chronic and embedded in human society, and will continue to evolve, waging a relentless life or death struggle, against vaccines, and constantly shapeshifts in efforts to breach human defenses. And we can really see this not only in COVID-19, which is kind of the obvious example, but other coronaviruses over the past few years, as well as even like influenza viruses as well. And this is all linked to, arguably, this expansion of industrial production, which kind of pushes increasingly capitalized wild foods deeper into the last of the primary landscape, which dredges out a wider variety of potentially proto-pandemic pathogens. So as the urbanization and corporate farmland grows further and further out, and population density in very poor regions increases, there furthers the risk of this interface and then spillover between wild and non-human populations, which might be carrying disease, and then a newly urbanized rurality. So worldwide then, even with this constant expansion, even the wildest kind of subsistence species are being roped into agricultural value chains. So all these animals which previously hadn't been contacted by agricultural value chains, such as ostriches, porcupines, crocodiles, fruit bats, whatever it might be, they are being increasingly integrated into the expanding agribusiness. They previously may have been really odd exotic delicacies, but are now becoming more and more integrated into these chains. Some of these, wild species are even coming onto forks before they are scientifically identified. And one example that I saw was a short-nosed dogfish, which is found in Taiwanese markets, for example, which haven't been properly identified, but are already being eaten by humans. And all of these exotic animals are being treated increasingly as food commodities. So nature is being stripped place by place, species by species, and it further fuels the drive for increasing more, the greater domination of nature by agribusiness and integrating all kinds of animal and wildlife into our food chains. So how this might work more concretely, I guess, just to bring this home, because of this process of agribusiness expansion, where peasant farmers have been pushed off the land that they used to farm, often these previous smallholders will either go into larger cities, which increases the density, especially of the poor slum regions in large cities. Whereas if people stay in rural regions, then they might then either become wage laborers for corporate agribusiness, or maybe even contractors, for example, and have their own maybe small scale industrial animal farming. So these two processes of more people being densely packed into cities, more then on the other hand, more people serving in agri-business food chains around the world, is an interlinked relationship which has fueled the potential or the risk for spread of viruses. So if you have, for instance, a highly concentrated industrial production of poultry, for instance, this industrial farm might be on the edge of wilderness, like exotic wilderness, which agribusiness has moved right in the midst of, and then maybe one of these poultry, chickens might catch a virus from the wilderness, which might be transmitted through some other vector. And in this really tightly packed conditions, this pathogen could move around, be able to rip through really closely situated populations of the same species, create a lot of mutations of itself, and then be able to jump quite easily to a human host, whether that's the contracted farmers or smallholders who are looking after that particular industrial farm, or it might be able to jump very easily to poor slums in major cities, which it also might be very close to as well. And then this would cause a sudden increase in the spread of a virus and the mutations of it as well. And if you ever have the desire to look at World Health Organization reports, and even in the Food and Agricultural Organization, there often is very reasonably frequently lots of outbreaks of viruses which are noted in various places around the world, situated normally in industrial farming, where then the farmer has to kill off, all of the poultry, kill off all of the pigs, whatever it might be. But often these don't really make the news at all anywhere because they're so regular to be now mundane. But there's this constant kind of risk of any of these viruses spreading over, and rather than just like killing all of the animals, perhaps the risk is that it might jump to humans at any stage, which is arguably maybe what happened during COVID-19. So as long as we keep pushing these further barriers of what we're eating, where agriculture is going, then it does potentially increase the likelihood of picking up new pathogens, while also reducing the environmental complexity which normally a forest would have, which would disrupt a transmission chain of a virus to the rest of the world. And like I mentioned before, the coronaviruses are particularly common viruses that do make this jump and do thrive on a less diverse environment. So we had, SARS-1 and SARS-2, they emerged possibly out of wet markets. And whereas MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Virus, which was the other deadly coronavirus, emerged straight out of industrializing camel sector in the Middle East as well. So despite this general shift in a population from commoditized rural areas to urban slums that continues, across the globe, the rural kind of urban divide, which drives much of the discussion around disease emergence, does miss the rural destined labor and the rapid growth of rural towns into either urban city villages or these kind of in-between cities. And so these newly kind of urbanizing landscapes act as both like local markets and regional hubs for global agricultural commodities which pass through them. And as a result, these forest disease dynamics, which has been spoken about, which are these pathogens, primeval kind of sources, they're no longer constrained to the hinterlands. There's already large populations of humans really close to these previous areas of wilderness. And so SARS, a SARS virus or a coronavirus can suddenly find itself spilling over to humans in a big city a really short time out of its bat cave. Ecosystems in which such like wild viruses were in part controlled by the complexities of a typical forest are being drastically streamlined by capital-led deforestation, and at the other end, this increased urban development by deficits in public health and environmental sanitation. And many of these pathogens that do escape do die off with their host species as a result. And again, typically in a diverse forest landscape, these infections are burnt out relatively quickly in the forest, if only by an irregular rate of encountering their typical host species. But now they're able to propagate much more successfully across susceptible human populations, whose vulnerability to infections in cities is often exaggerated by the other end of neoliberalism, which we've discussed before as well, such as by austerity programs, which has reduced, healthcare, public health, and also corrupted regulation, which is something we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But even in the face of efficacious vaccines, the resulting outbreaks are characterized by great extent, duration, and momentum. And what were once just very local spillovers are now epidemics which trawl their ways through global webs of travel and trade. So by this kind of parallax effect, by change in their environmental background alone, old viruses such as Ebola, Zika, malaria, and yellow fever have really evolved comparatively little, have still made sharp turns into regional threats. They've suddenly moved from spilling over into small remote villages now and again to suddenly infecting thousands of people in capital cities. And in something at the other end of the ecological direction, even wild animals, which were routinely long-time disease reservoir, are suffering blowbacks. Their populations, which are fragmented by deforestation, for example, native New World monkeys, are susceptible to wild type of yellow fever, which they've been exposed to for hundreds of years, but are now suddenly losing their herd immunity and dying in the hundreds of thousands because of this slowly I guess like constraining amount of wilderness and smaller habitats and more human contact, which has allowed viruses to replicate so quickly and be so devastating. So, I think one of the papers I was reading preparing for this is really made the point that we need to retain the shock that we receive when we learn another coronavirus has emerged out of its wildlife area and in a matter of 8 weeks splattered itself across humanity. The COVID virus emerged at one terminus of a regional supply line in exotic foods, which successfully set off the human-to-human change of infections at the other end of Wuhan, China. And from there, the outbreak both diffused locally and hopped onto planes and trains and spread out across the globe through a web structured by travel connections and down a hierarchy from large to smaller cities. And there has obviously been, literature which has described, a wild food market and the consumption of exotic animals in this kind of a typical Orientalist fashion. But little effort really has been expended so far on more obvious questions, which is like, how did the exotic food sector arrive at a standing where it could sell its wares alongside more traditional livestock in the largest market in Wuhan? These animals weren't sold off the back of a truck or in an alleyway. There would have been permits and payments and deregulation involved to allow, all kinds of animals which had never been integrated into human society in such large numbers be sold to human populations and have such a dense interaction with human populations. And this wild food sector is an important one, and it's becoming increasingly formalized and even especially capitalized by the same sources which back industrial agricultural production. So the overlapping kind of economic geography which has made up this issue extends back from the Wuhan market to the hinterlands, where exotic and traditional foods are raised by operations which is bordering edges of a rapidly contracting wilderness. And as more and more industrial production, just to really emphasize this point, encroaches on the last of the forests that we have, wild food operations then cut further in to raise their delicacies or raid the last stands of exotic animals. And so then as a result, the most exotic of pathogens, such as the bat-hosted COVID-19, find their way onto a truck, whether in food, animals, or the human labor tending to them, and then shotgun from one end of a lengthening peri-urban circuit to another before hitting the world stage. So by its global expansion alone, this commodity agriculture serves as both a propulsion for and nexus through which pathogens of diverse origins migrate from the most remote reservoirs to the most international of population centers. And it's here and along the way where novel pathogens infiltrate agriculture's gated communities. The lengthier the associated supply chains and the greater extent of associated deforestation, the more diverse and exotic the zoonotic pathogens that might enter the food chain. Among recent emergent and re-emergent farm and foodborne pathogens, which have originated from across the anthropogenic domain, are a whole host of viruses like African swine fever, Campylobacter, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, Ebola Restorum, E. coli, 0157H7, foot and mouth diseases, hepatitis E, listeria, Nipah Q fever, salmonella, Vibrio, Yersinia, and then heaps of novel influenza variants like H1N1, H1N2V, H9N2, H7N9, H7, N7, and so on and so forth. So, there's a huge number of these foodborne pathogens which are spreading like wildfire, and it's only just a matter of risk and likelihood and sometimes luck whether they break out from local to then regional and then global size pandemics. So however unintended, the entirety of production line is organized around practices that arguably accelerate the evolution of pathogenic virulence and subsequent transmission. Growing genetic monocultures, food animals and plants with nearly identical genomes for existence also removes immune fire breaks that in more diverse populations slow down transmissions. Pathogens can now just quickly evolve around the commonplace host immune genotypes. Meanwhile, crowded conditions, either humans or animals, depress immune responses. Larger farm animal population sizes and factory farm densities facilitate, obviously, greater transmission and recurrent infection. And so high throughput, which is a part of any industrial production, provides a continually renewed supply of susceptible hosts at barn, farm, and regional levels, which removes the cap on the evolution of pathogen deadliness. Housing a lot of animals together rewards those strains that can burn through them best. Decreasing the age of slaughter, which is also something which is very common, for example, in chickens, where the age of slaughter has been reduced to 6 weeks, is also likely to suggest pathogens able to survive more robust immune systems. and replicate themselves quick enough to go to other organisms before their host is killed. Lengthening the geographic extent of live animal trade and export has also increased the diversity of genomic segments that their associated pathogens exchange, which increases the rate at which disease agents explore their evolutionary possibilities. So these interlinked processes, which have come from the expansion of agribusiness throughout the world, which have displaced peasant holders from their land, increased the density of urban centers, created the necessity of turning previous smallholder agriculture into industrial production, whether it be monocultures or animal industrial production, has meant that there's a decreasing amount of wilderness, which has meant these, previously exotic viruses, which would have just had petered out in a particular forest, for example, are now able to jump to hosts, which are then either industrial farm animals packed together in really tight environments, which then can quickly, decimate that particular animal population and then jump to the humans, which are nearby in large amounts of numbers. So we are creating an environment where it's much easier for viral pathogens and maybe other pathogens in the future to quickly make jumps between hosts to then causing huge regional and global outbreaks. So that's kind of some political economy, I guess, of why we might have suddenly seen an increase in expansion of virus pandemics and spread, especially over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, let's talk about the policy responses to COVID-19 in Australia. So again, this might be very, retreading some familiar grounds for you all and maybe some painful ones. But we'll go through this, and then I want you to think especially about the policy responses for our speaker in the workshop this week, which I'll talk on in a little bit more soon. So the first COVID-19 case in Australia was confirmed on January 25th, 2020. The social distancing measures that were then kind of increasingly instigated in late March, early April 2020, which included banning public gatherings of more than 2 people, shutting down non-essential businesses. After the National Cabinet announced a 3-step plan on May the 8th, 2020 to relax COVID-19 restrictions, states and territories then eased their regional containment measures. But then, as we all know, from July to early November 2020, a regional COVID-19 resurgence triggered a renewed lockdown in metropolitan Melbourne and tightening of restrictions for the state of Victoria as a whole. Since then, there was also temporary lockdowns in South Australia, such as November 2020, Sydney's Northern Beaches in December 2020 to January 2021, Perth and adjacent areas in Western Australia, multiple times in 2021 and then after 2022, Brisbane in March 2021, and then Victoria between May, June 2021. Now in mid-June 2021, Greater Sydney started, in 2020 rather, sorry, Greater Sydney started reporting a few new cases of the highly infectious Delta variant. I think this is 2021. Followed by more locally transmitted outbreaks in late June and a 2-week lockdown, which ended July the 9th. Then in the Northern Territory was also placed under lockdown for 2 days, but then that was extended for a little over a week. And then Queensland imposed a snap lockdown from June 29th until July the 2nd. And Greater Perth had a similar lockdown schedule as well. And so these lockdowns were quite sporadic, especially even up to mid-2021, which was one of the main policy responses to try to limit the spread of the viruses. And as we know, Australia is a very decentralized federation compared to other countries that permits each state and territory to enact policies that respond to a local context. And typically the health policies are usually state and territorial responsibility. And so most of the COVID-19 pandemic policy restrictions were introduced by the state and territory governments and their health officials. The federal government in this division of labor had focused on responsibilities that fall within their purview which included international travel restrictions, healthcare funding, economic stimulus, employment insurance, and vaccine procurement. The federal government particularly led Australia's kind of economic responses to the pandemic. As many of us know, they instituted a job seeker supplement for those who are seeking employment, as well as JobKeeper. And they also financed a pandemic leave disaster payment as well. Now, as we all know, painfully, Victoria had the most consistently stringent policies during 2021, with 6 periods of stay-at-home orders and over double the length of school closures for Melbourne than any other state or territory, which ended up being over 170 days in total for 2021. These lockdowns here in Victoria were seen as temporary measures to limit the outbreaks in certain areas, and in the hope to stop the spread of COVID-19 and limit the burden on the healthcare system, while the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines in Australia were delayed. Whereas contrastingly, New South Wales had quite a similar periods of significant outbreaks, but the New South Wales government was more hesitant to implement as stringent policy measures as Victoria out of concern of the impact on the economy and small businesses. And really, during most of 2020, up until July 2021, all Australian jurisdictions were attempting to maintain a COVID-0 approach by introducing these snap lockdowns to limit the spread of COVID-19, typically around the capital city areas. At the beginning of 2022, all jurisdictions except Western Australia, had decreased most of their closure and containment policies, even as case numbers were an all-time high. Because the nation reached high vaccination rates, Omicron was revealed to be less fatal and causing lower hospitalization rates, and also people are obviously very sick of these snap lockdowns. Now, in terms of Victoria, there are really 4 notable COVID-19 waves in Victoria. The first was in response to the initial community spread. So on March the 12th, 2020, Victoria recorded its first community transmission of COVID-19, which marked the beginning of this first wave. It did not represent a large outbreak by the standards of later waves, but it did trigger the state's first lockdown and rolling out of heavy restrictions for this first time. So on March the 16th, the state of emergency was declared and gathering of over 500 people were banned. 2 days later, this was reduced to 100 people on March the 25th. And then stage 2 restrictions entered into force with closure of non-essential services. And then finally, on March 31st, 2020, stage 3 restrictions enforced a full lockdown. And so this meant, as you remember, that there was only 4 reasons to leave the home: food and supplies, medical care, exercise, and work or education. Cases still slowly rose during this period, and on 30th of June 2020, a lockdown for specific postcodes in Melbourne's north and west, where transmissions was high, was announced, along with a strict lockdown of some public housing towers, which is a really controversial decision, which has also resulted in court cases and then reimbursement of those affected people. This postcode lockdown then expanded to a full lockdown across Melbourne local government areas and the Mitchell Shire on the July 9th, 2020. And Victoria then was experiencing this second wave of COVID-19 cases, which was much larger than our first one. The lockdown restrictions were originally in line with the stage 3 restrictions from earlier in the year, but on August the 2nd, 2020, with the lockdown having failed to stop rising case numbers, Victoria then declared a state of disaster, which replaced the existing state of emergency, and a stage 4 lockdown was announced. So in addition to the existing restrictions we had, exercise was limited to 1 hour per day, travel was not allowed beyond 5 kilometers, and a curfew was placed from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. There was some slight easing of these restrictions in September and October, and then our finally that lockdown then was lifted on October 28th, 2020. So the COVID-0 policy, at this time in Victoria was deemed successful. Then there was several short lockdowns in 2021 in response to specific outbreaks. The approach here was to try to use lockdowns to give contact tracers time to identify and isolate the contacts of positive cases. Victoria, for instance, we introduced lockdowns from February 13th to 17th, May 28th to June 10th, and July 16th to July 27th in 2021. And this last lockdown was introduced in response to the Delta variant. These lockdowns were all billed as stage 4 restrictions, and they were much like that second lockdown we had in 2020, but without the curfew. But then that later lockdown in July 2021 didn't manage to quash the outbreak, and cases started rising again. And just 9 days after leaving our 5th lockdown, Victoria entered its 6th on August 5th, 2022. The rules are much the same, but the response was unlike that for previous waves. And 3 factors changed the approach the government took. The first was that Delta was more infectious than previous strains, meaning lockdowns, they slowed the spread, but they didn't reduce case numbers like previous lockdowns. The second was that restrictions seemed to have not worked as well as in previous waves, with lockdown fatigue leading to more limited compliance with public health orders. And there was a great deal of media coverage of lockdown breaches in Victoria that also might have been over-exaggerated. And finally, number 3, this was the first major wave of infections in Victoria since the vaccines had become available in Australia. And although at the start of the wave, this time our vaccination rate overall as a country was comparatively low compared to the rest of the world, it still gave, or the government saw that they had another tool to fight COVID-19. Then there was that formal abandonment of the zero COVID policy across Australia by federal and state leaders, except notably for Western Australia. So this was kind of a, that was kind of a blow by blow how the state government in Victoria responded to the various COVID waves that we experienced, and most commonly with lockdowns in pursuit of a zero COVID policy at first. Now, in terms of at the federal level, like we mentioned, they kind of dealt mostly with the economic, in the economic realm. So there was predominantly fiscal stimulus, which consisted of expenditure and revenue measures, which was worth $312 billion, which is nearly 16% of 2020's GDP. That was put in place and has been for the entirety of the pandemic and budgeted up to 2025. Nearly 2/3 of the stimulus expired by mid-2021, which included that JobKeeper and JobSeeker that we mentioned before, which dispersed estimated payments of about $89 billion through to the end of March 2021. And the stimulus otherwise also included the health response package, which was another $20 billion, to money to secure access to COVID-19 vaccines, roll out a national vaccination program, strengthen health systems, protect vulnerable people, especially those in aged care, and provide more financial support to the states and territories. And importantly, since the onset of the pandemic, the Reserve Bank of Australia also announced packages of monetary easing, which included policy rate cuts and buying government bonds as well. The overnight cash rate was cut to 0.25% in March 2020, and then further reduced to 0.1% in November 2020. And the interest rate on commercial banks' exchange settlements were reduced to 0 at the RBA. So, these measures have been, as we all know, have been gradually or quite quickly reversed over the last year or so, with interest rates suddenly getting up, much higher than they were during the COVID pandemic. So the RBA also introduced yield targeting on 3-year government bonds, which basically meant like they're purchasing government bonds in the secondary market, and to the tune of about 100 billion Australian dollars, and bought 5 to 10-year government bonds issued by the Australian government, as well as the states and territories throughout 2020. And this purchase program of government bonds was expanded to $200 billion through to the end of 2021. So this basically meant that the Reserve Bank of Australia was buying up the promises of debt repayment from the Australian government at various levels, which infused the government with lots of money comparatively, and was something that was occurring around the world by the central banks were buying up government bonds, which is something that was really quite unique to the policy response to COVID-19, not only in Australia, but around the world, with central banks actually intervening in the economy to buy up government bonds, inject a lot of capital to the states. Again, which is something that was kind of anathema in neoliberalism previously. So this is kind of more, a factual account again of what happened more or less with the Australian policy response to COVID-19. This week, like I mentioned at the start, we'll have Dr. Tom Shador come into our in-person workshop, and I'll record his presentation for those of you who aren't there. And he'll discuss more thoroughly about the political economy, I guess, of these policy responses from the perspective of more critical international relations theory. So Tom's discussion will be very much based on your questions. So please come with questions for him. And I'd really encourage you all to read the chapter of his book that I put as recommended reading, which is called The Locked Up Country. So please make sure you read that, because his presentation will talk a little bit more about the political economy of where these policy failures come from. And most of what he'll be addressing is that the failure to prepare for and react to the COVID-19 outbreak, didn't just start when countries couldn't respond to the COVID-19 spreading out of Wuhan. And it didn't, just start, for instance, in the United States when, Donald Trump dismantled the, pandemic preparation team, or cut the, hundreds of positions from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, for example. And, it didn't also start either when, the United States axed expert jobs in the same Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in China, which also would have meant there was, someone who was monitoring the situation on the ground, which could have then helped, for example, the United States as well as the Western response. And also, the problems didn't start when there wasn't a coordinated response to the COVID pandemic. So this total kind of failure in policy response to COVID-19, as Dr. Tom Shador will go into more detail, has been really programmed decades ago in the in the way that the shared commons of public health have similarly been kind of neglected and monetized over time, especially in the last 50 years. So where we've gone from generally widespread public health provision in a lot of Western industrialized countries to a regime of more individualized, just-in-time healthcare and epidemiology, with barely enough hospital beds to support a normal population as it is. Then, there's no way that our health systems could marshal the resources necessary to deal with such a huge pandemic. So, this is kind of the context that Dr. Tom Shador will talk about a little bit more. And a lot of more critical international relation theorists have been saying that, although it's very hard to say, based on the origin or the fundamental level of our healthcare system as it has been under 40 years or 50 years of austerity, to know exactly what is possible to have been done. But there are some suggestions that critical theorists have had, and I want you to maybe think about these and even quiz Dr. Tom Shador on them, and how likely they are. So critical theorists have said that one of the things that we could do, for instance, is nationalize hospitals, which Spain did, in response to the outbreak, rather than expand like private hospitals and private capacity. Need to ensure that there's, much better apparatuses for testing in huge amounts of volume and turning around those test results quickly. Again, thinking about, if we have future pandemics, we need to be able to know the epidemiological data really quickly. And we need to even like socialize pharmaceuticals so that vaccines and pharmaceutical treatments aren't prohibitively expensive. We need to make sure there's maximum protection for medical staff to slow staff, decay, morbidity, and death. We need to have the right to repair for like ventilators and other medical machinery. Often, once medical machinery has any kind of issues, they're thrown away. And that's often the decision of the manufacturers themselves, because they don't allow or have the capacity to allow for repair. We need to ensure we like mass produce, pharmaceuticals and antivirals that, seem promising to address viral replication. We need to, make sure we have clinical trials and further research, which is just beyond a purely laboratory setting as well. We should have maybe even more health planning, which forces companies to produce ventilators and personal protective equipment, which will be required by healthcare workers in the next pandemic, and not just made just in time for when that pandemic hits. Maybe we need to prioritize allocation of resources to places with the greatest needs, and even establish like a massive pandemic corps to provide the workforce from research to care that approaches the order of demand for viral pandemics. That it places upon us, so that we are ready, and we don't have to suddenly marshal all those people into these roles and train them when we're already being hit by the pandemic. And ensuring, of course, that we have the necessary number of critical care beds, staffing, and equipment necessary, so we can suppress the numbers as they appear, and even just like so we can respond to our own healthcare problems without the virus. So we can't merely accept the idea of just surviving COVID-19 barely to then return to our previous laxity of pandemic preparatedness, our previous like hollowing out of the health system, and our previous individualized, atomized, and for-profit health industry. So we need to actually have a health system that can be flexible enough to respond to these health challenges, which then will, obviously need broader reconfiguration and reconstruction in our broader socioeconomic system. But, obviously, until we have such a program, it's going to be very difficult for the population to protect themselves if we have another, mass viral pandemic. So yes, so these are some of the things that critical theorists have suggested, and for me as a previous medical doctor, I saw the evisceration of our medical system at first hand, and it was wholly unsurprising to me that we couldn't handle the flood of people who are sick and dying from a pandemic. So there's a lot of things that we need to potentially do to be able to handle another one that might come, which, because of the structural drivers we spoke about before, is probably more likely than not. Now, let's just briefly end with talking about international relations and the pandemic. So, and the massive disruptions that we had, which were brought by the virus, has really served as a timely reminder that world politics is not only shaped by human actions, and that international relations has quite an idiosyncratic hierarchy of what it pays attention to. So long, the discipline's been focused on big IR questions of war and peace, great powers and their leaders, and also certain forms of human suffering and harm. And these preoccupations with these so-called big questions of IR have led to partial readings of history. Because, as we know, the classical origins of international relations are generally traced back to the city-state system of ancient Greece, and I think it's Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. My pronunciation is terrible. And the conventional history of the academic discipline usually commences with the First World War and the founding of the first chair in international politics at Aberystwyth. I think my pronunciation awful. But if we look at these key moments again, they were also defined by pestilence. Like the plague of Athens raged through the city-state during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, while the Spanish flu pandemic commenced during the final year of World War I. So across international history, in ways that international relations has often failed to fully appreciate, pandemics have often shaped politics historically. The Antonine and Justinianic plagues of the 2nd and 6th centuries played important roles in weakening the Roman and Eastern Roman empires and transformed the economic and political dynamics upon which processes of state formation would actually occur. And the Black Death of the 14th century helped undermine feudalism as a social system and particular patterns of faith, which then opened the door for new forms of economic, social, and political organization in Central and Western Europe. Even much more recently, HIV/AIDS has asked existential questions about society, states, and global justice, although referring to countries that exist still at the periphery of disciplinary attention. So this experience of the ongoing pandemic encourages really a reassessment about how the discipline has thought about the role of health in shaping global politics, and a reconsideration of whether our ways of knowing and doing IR match with the kind of realities that COVID-19 has brought forth. But there has been, a really good body of literature of, international relations specialists that have responded to the questions thrown up by COVID-19. If we're trying to, do that categorization, which I said we shouldn't do, but if we're kind of think about, what kind of responses they have been, there's maybe two broad approaches that, we can identify through a bit of a literature review. And both of these approaches ask quite similar questions, which is around, what COVID-19 means for our politics, but of different ways of responding. So the first is, despite its many divergent perspectives, largely satisfied working within, the long-standing theories and concepts in the discipline, like, realism, liberalism, whatever it might be, which is underpinned ultimately by an anthropomorphic account of the world. The second approach, which is also, just as diverse, has tried to make more of a decisive step towards the non-human and attempts to see COVID-19 as a biological reality, which is separate from our human representation of it, which incorporates a wider conception of agency, and from that, how to understand the pandemic. And that's one that integrates, basically what really we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, integrates more of understanding how, animals, bacteria, viruses, broadly nature, is also just as vital in international relations as human actors. Now, we'll discuss a little bit more on the IR responses to the pandemic in our workshop this week, but I wanted to just sketch out those two broad approaches in the literature that you can maybe identify. Now, this week in workshops is our last workshop. Like I said, we've got Dr. Tom Shador coming to speak to us in the in-person class. We'll also have the grand final Kahoot, which will be very exciting. And obviously, the winners of that will have lifelong glory and honor for winning it. But also importantly for your assessment, please remember the quiz, the last all readings week 6 quiz. And just remember, like I mentioned at the start, the weeks that I haven't quizzed you on are the ones where you most likely will be getting the vast majority of the questions. Okay, so please keep that in mind. I'll also make some announcements in the workshops about the assessments coming up, so please stay tuned for that. But otherwise, team, thank you very, very much for tuning into my lectures, even though I appreciate sometimes I do have gone a bit long and I've sometimes meander, but I hope that you've been able to grasp some of the key points, and thank you very much for being so attentive. But I look forward to seeing you all in class this week. Thank you very much, everyone.